First of all, there is a quiz going on right now. It is open. You don't need this lecture to be able to take it. It is everything up until last lecture, including the readings for this week. It is just like the last one, 5 questions. We'll go, and it will be done with by midnight tomorrow. Or I always get confused by the AM PM. Friday at 11:59. That's a lot better. So be sure to take that. Remember last time we had 23% of people who didn't take it. It's not that much of a hit on your overall grade, but it certainly hurts you from the beginning. So, pay attention, go take that when you are ready. Should be really quick, and I took it, and it took me probably a minute. Of course, I know the answers. Anyways, last time we left off at George Washington's farewell address that he had basically set the standard for what a president should be. He made many mistakes, but he left gracefully. But at the same time, he was seeing the rise of factionalism, and that's the main thing that he denounced, though there were many other things, which will be on the test, or a quiz, I should say. But the rise of factionalism came with a series of debates that were part of his cabinet meetings. Remember, we talked about the 1790 compromise between Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison, but the Hamilton-Jefferson debates continued because, well, despite the fact that they had compromised, both of them didn't like that compromise, so they worked to undermine it constantly. They constantly were arguing about whether or not the central bank's charter was to be renewed, even though it had only been created in 1791. That there was continuous arguments over tariffs, because one of the things about tariffs is that it tends to favor places that are exporting. But when you have the South basically exporting most of its goods to the North, the South is mostly trying to get its goods from foreign countries. And so that adversely affects them by basically taxing those manufactured goods that are coming into the country. Now, funny enough, even though you will hear Southerners even today talk about how tariffs were bad for the South, the worst affected state of them all throughout the entirety of the history that we are talking about here, all the way to 1877 when this class ends, was New York, not the South. New York paid the vast majority of tariffs. Now, how a tariff works is that it isn't actually New York paying it, it is goods being imported into New York. But because New York was the trade capital of the U.S., especially later, but even at this point they're the financial capital of the U.S., they are importing more than anyone else. And a lot of those goods would end up spreading from New York, but ultimately, New York is the one paying for all this. And guess where Hamilton is from? New York. So, it's kind of funny when you think about it, is basically Hamilton kept on pushing for more tariffs so that it could help growing cities, even though kind of hurt himself, right? Well, he's more concerned about elites, right? He's more wanting a central banking system. He wants growth of industry and that kind of stuff. He's not particularly concerned with the little guy, the laborer, the farmer, the fisherman, that kind of thing. Those are not really of concern to him because he's more concerned about building a nation. That there needs to be centralized authority. And centralized authority, to him at least, meant elites. Screw the fisherman, screw the farmer, screw the laborer. He was extremely anti-democratic, which was kind of the position of the Federalists. So can you guess what the people who followed Jefferson called themselves? The Democratic Republicans. Because, well, they believed in democracy. They wanted to, democracy just means demos, as in the people. The more people that you enfranchise, the more people that you bring into the system, the more democracy. You'll hear people talking about oh, we're a republic, not a democracy. It's like, well, we're a republic with democracy, and from the founding all the way to the present, it has been often about how much more democracy can we bring in. And that's what the Jeffersonian Republicans, or Democratic Republicans, were founded upon. Basically trying to remove a lot of those property right clauses because people couldn't vote without property rights. Of course, Jefferson himself actually didn't want the removal of those things. He believed that the only way you could be a good citizen is if you owned property. That's why he had originally written that in the Declaration, saying pursuit of property. But understand, elitism is a moving target. It's a thing that at some points it seems like, all the founders were elites. But in other ways, it's like, no, the Federalists were the elitists, the Republicans were not. So, it goes back and forth depending on your definition. But ultimately, this is how the first party election went in 1796. That there were two parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists, with Alexander Hamilton basically being their figurehead, their ideological figurehead, though he was going through a sex scandal, so he couldn't run for president. They ran Thomas Pinckney and John Adams, who all wanted centralized government, tariffs, and also particularly important is their position towards the growing war between France and Britain. Remember, George Washington actually tried to reposition the U.S. from being allies with the French to basically being neutral, but this had the effect of breaking that alliance, and this will have drastic ramifications. But the Federalists continue George Washington's kind of arbitrary neutrality, let's call it that. Or basically they're anti-French. The Democratic Republicans ran Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr, and James Madison, all of which wanted to basically disinvest the government to make it so that there weren't any more tariffs needed to fund it. And they were fairly pro-French. After all, Jefferson himself had been an ambassador to France during the Revolution, and in fact he had been in the room when the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, their basically foundational document, was written. There were two people who wrote it and one advisor. That one advisor was Thomas Jefferson. So they're fairly pro-French. But the election comes, and there's a quirk in the electoral system at this point, because the person who gets the most electoral votes wins the presidency, but the vice president is selected by who gets the second most electoral votes. So this creates a horrible dynamic, because John Adams wins, and Thomas Jefferson comes in second place. So Thomas Jefferson is the vice president. You basically have opposing parties, one as the president, one as the vice. You can see this is kind of a recipe for disaster. Even though the vice president doesn't actually have that much power, besides being able to sit on the Senate floor and basically split any vote that comes in 50-50. Besides that, the vice president doesn't really have much power, but at the same time, even though it's not fully established, imagine what it would be like today if, like, we had an opposing party president, and then the president died and the vice president took over. Now, that line of succession wouldn't actually be established for years. In fact, really wouldn't be established until the 1850s, even though there will be a death in the 1820s. 1830s, right? No, 20s. William Henry Harrison, that's the name of the guy who died. But, no, it's 20s, because the 20-year curse. So, despite that, it's a very clear problem. At the same time, Adams will be the first president to actually reside in the White House. Though it's not called the White House at this point, we'll get to that much later. Because the British will have something to do with that. But, so there's this transfer of power and a transfer of the location of that power. But there's this group dynamic that Adams has a Federalist cabinet. You know, he gets to appoint his own heads of each department. But he has a vice president who's just sitting there in the wings waiting to undermine him. But first, those problems with the change between being pro-French, being allied with the French, to being somewhat neutral will come to bite the U.S. in the bud. During the Revolution, remember, they had been our ally. We had signed an alliance with them. But according to Adams, that alliance was broken by them killing their king in 1793. And this is kind of the same logic that George Washington used to make the Jay Treaty. So the ambassadorial ties between the U.S. and France had basically been broken, and France was fighting a war with Britain. So it's kind of a, if you're not my friend, you're my enemy kind of situation. So the U.S., of course, tried to send ambassadors to basically create a Jay Treaty with them. But then when our ambassadors arrived, they demanded bribes from them. Now, this was actually a standard practice in Europe at the time, that in order to negotiate, you basically entreat the power that you are meeting with. It's kind of the same thing that we were doing at that time with the various Indian tribes. But this was seen as an affront by the this was seen as an affront by the Americans, who, thought that forcing a bribe out of somebody that you're supposed to be negotiating with was abhorrent. And so they stormed out of there. This essentially broke all diplomatic relations. And at this point in time, remember, if you're not my friend, you're my enemy. This turned to what is called the Quasi-War, which was almost completely naval bound, but the U.S. and France did end up fighting. So, at first, the French began raiding U.S. merchant vessels. They had privateers throughout the oceans. This is standard practice at the time. In fact, it would be standard practice all the way up until World War I. That basically they're licensed pirates that you get to go and attack and raid the enemy's merchant vessels because they're working for the enemy. But the problem is there was no declaration of war. So France started raiding, French privateers started raiding despite the U.S. and France not being officially at war. This became particularly bad when one of these privateers actually started flying the French flag and turned out to actually be a French naval frigate called the La Croyable. La Croyable. It's French. Let's not even try. The La Croyable. The first head of the U.S. Navy, Stephen Decatur Sr., who his son, Stephen Decatur Jr., will become famous for other things we'll talk about later, went and caught the La Croyable, and this basically started the war because once he captured it, it was commissioned as a U.S. Navy vessel called the USS Retaliation. Bit of a name on the nose, And on July 9th, 1798, Congress authorized the use of force, which started a bunch of naval battles throughout the Caribbean, especially. There were even some fights off the coast of France. But the main thing is these were naval engagements, almost entirely. But remember, this started in early 1798, use of force in July of 1798, but this continued for multiple years. The U.S. would attack French islands, the French would continue to capture U.S. vessels. It was a whole mess. In fact, there were roughly 2,000 U.S. merchant vessels raided by the French. Some of these are the same merchant vessels, but 2,000 raids. And, but it wasn't really that deadly because less than 100 Americans died in all this. The French had 4 ships captured and a little more than 20 folks. There's, of course, the privateers are unknown dead because they were kind of treated as pirates by us, meaning they're hanged on sight, and we didn't keep records of that. Also, they lost 8 ships to the sea. But at the same time, there's a revolution happening in Haiti. This is a slave revolt that turns into an actual revolution, the most successful slave revolt of all time, and ends up creating Haiti, because it was Santo Domingo at this point. The U.S., being stuck in this weird limbo, this quasi-war, decides to support the rebels. So John Adams actually sends, from June 1799 to July 1800, he sends U.S. U.S. aid in the form of war material, as in armament. So you could see this as like the first truly anti-slavery measure of the U.S., that we supported the Haitian Revolution as part of this. But it was purely a ploy to gain a hand throughout all of this quasi-war stuff. But things weren't going so well at home, because you can guess it wasn't exactly a popular war. There were a lot of people who were angered by all of this. And the Federalists, being a bunch of elitists as they were, decided this dissent was something to stamp out. And so they passed a series of acts called the Alien and Sedition Acts. Basically, if you advocated against the war, that was considered seditious libel, and you could be jailed. Or if you said anything negative against the government. It specifically stated, uttering or publishing any false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States was punishable. So the Alien Acts also made it so that naturalization into being a U.S. citizen was made more difficult, and the president could declare people as enemy aliens, as in the French. If they weren't a U.S. citizen and they were French, they could be declared enemy aliens and deported. And deporting at this point is a lot more hazardous than it is today, because today when we deport somebody, it is done under our own dime. Back then, it was done by theirs, and this is an era that transporting back across the sea could make you indentured, basically a forced laborer for a number of years. So this is some serious stuff, and especially there's some states at this point that are passing what are called pauper laws that make it illegal for enemy aliens or aliens of any sort to be poor. That if they're paupers, as in hobos or homeless people or anything along those lines, that they're ruled to be a pauper, they can be deported. So you can see this is a pretty heavy burden. There's Jefferson just sitting there taking notes as all of this is happening, right? And this happened pretty quickly in 1798. One of the most ridiculous things that happened under the Sedition Act was that during a military parade in Washington, a gunshot was fired, basically a negligent discharge, and and some guy literally said, "I hope that hit Adams in the ass." He went to jail for that. For 4 days, and was fined, I think it was $100. Fined $100 for the joke. Some of these were a lot worse. In fact, a Democratic Republican congressman was jailed and then elected to Congress again from jail. And this actually took a couple of lives because one of the publishers died in jail. Another person, one of the newspapermen who was jailed for speaking out against the war, died in jail. Another committed suicide. So this was not bloodless. And of course, a direct tax had to be levied in order to pay for the growth of the Navy as part of all this. In 1798, a tax on the states, basically the federal government was saying states had to pay X amount of money, and they said $2 million. Now, at that point, $2 million is the equivalent of $17 billion. Pennsylvania decided to pay for this by levying taxes on the number of windows you have on your house. This is actually a pretty standard tactic on property taxes, that you basically figure out how many rooms are in there by the number of windows that are on the exterior. But local militias didn't like that so much, so they started fomenting revolt to basically stop the tax collectors. Kind of the same thing that happened with the Whiskey Rebellion. Marshals were sent out, and the mob decided to grab up anybody that the marshals were taking into jail and free them from jail. So troops were eventually sent, but with no action. On the 21st of May, 1800, general amnesty was given, and basically the whole thing stopped. As soon as you send in troops, that's pretty much the end of any kind of rioting. So with all of this going on, the U.S. finally manages to bring back diplomatic relations in September of 1800. But this is at the same time as an election is going on. But in the middle of it, the peace treaty that was signed by the Convention of 1800 ended the Quasi-War and also the 1778 alliance between France. So officially, the U.S. is completely neutral, and this Quasi-War ends all of that. You can see how this kind of back and forth is an important part, but that Alien and Sedition Act, that is Adams' ruin, because it's an election year. And Jefferson wins the election pretty handily. So much so that his vice president is I don't know how to have that, is another Jeffersonian Republican. That's how much the Alien and Sedition Acts were disliked. The election got pretty nasty. For instance, Adams said, "Jefferson is a hideous hermaphroditic character, which has neither the force and firmness of a man, nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman." Yeah, if you think our elections get pretty nasty, this was pretty nasty. In fact, it got so nasty that it was called the Revolution of 1800. Jefferson, in turn, said, "Adams is a mean-spirited, low-lived fellow, the son of a half-breed Indian squaw, sired by a Virginian mulatto father." Jefferson was pretty racist, even for his time. Although you can see Adams was pretty sexist. So, they go hand in hand, right? Both of these guys are pretty elite fellows. Adams is a lawyer. Jefferson owns something like 100 slaves. These are folks who are rich and powerful. But the Alien and Sedition Act pretty much seals the deal, as you can see, with all the green. And realize territories cannot vote for president. So those western territories are not part of this. So you just have that little bit of beige up in the north. So with all of this stuff between France and everything, Jefferson quickly repeals the Sedition Act and starts reorienting the U.S. towards France, which leads towards the Louisiana Purchase. So remember back in 1762, France had lost Louisiana to Spain, but Spain was now aligned with France in 1800, and Napoleon, who had just become dictator of France, and in fact his brother would eventually become the king of Spain for a little bit, though quickly pushed out because of a war. But his brother had also negotiated that whole convention of 1800. So there's a lot of Spanish influence on all this kind of stuff. And finally, in 1800, at the same time as that convention was happening, the Spanish sign over Louisiana to the French again. So they hold it for 3 years, basically hoping to launch expeditions to create a new French empire, to basically take back what they had lost. But first, they have that whole Haiti issue. And remember, the U.S. had actually supported Haiti, but now with Jefferson, who's a slave owner, doesn't exactly like the idea of slaves taking back power. This will become especially brutal in 1806 when those former slaves end up massacring basically most of the French on the island. Remember, a lot of revolutions turn to civil war. Well, in this case, also a lot of revolutions turn to genocide. But that's all in the future at this point. Jefferson is just trying to distance himself from all that and let France do their thing. So in 1801, France launches an expedition to Haiti, but it doesn't go so well. And in fact, by the end of 1803, they had been completely defeated, mostly because of malaria, not actual fighting, but the fighting eventually takes them before Napoleon can even do anything. Napoleon actually resorts to some pretty nasty tactics. For instance, mass drownings and the possibility of even using mass poisoning in ship's holds. So this is a really nasty war. And it becomes quite clear to Napoleon that it's not working. And so he loses interest in Louisiana completely. And so in 1803, since diplomatic relations had resumed since 1800, Jefferson says that he will buy New Orleans, just this little point right here, for $10 million, which is quite a bit at that point. But Napoleon doesn't really care about New Orleans at all. So he offers a counteroffer. For an extra $5 million, you can take the entire Louisiana territory. So the person who was sent to negotiate that jumps on it without even contacting Congress or anything, says yes, negotiates the treaty, and basically fulfills Jefferson's mandate by going an extra step. Realize Jefferson's supposed to be about small government, right? This is a huge, huge step for the power of the government to suddenly just take more territory by levying more taxes to get that territory. So Jefferson is violating one of the core principles that he was elected upon here, which, ends up getting in front of Congress to ratify the treaty, and so some of that is brought up. But ultimately, as Jefferson called it, the call of the Empire of Liberty is too much for them. We now call that Manifest Destiny. That term doesn't come around until 1845. But at this point, Jefferson was calling this the Empire of Liberty. And so he sends out folks to start exploring the place, especially with oh, crud, I can't remember the name. Where are we? Lewis and Clark. There we go. Jesus. So, in August of 1803, Lewis and Clark create the Corps of Discovery to basically try to chart out where this Louisiana Purchase goes. Now, this map is kind of like what we say it is, but at this point, it's completely up for debate what Louisiana counts as. In fact, one of the problems is that the Louisiana Purchase was debated to include all of what we now call Texas, because the French had actually landed in Texas first and made claim to it before the Spanish, even though the Spanish had conquistadors go through there. They basically were lost. One of them happened to be, three of them happened to be the first Spanish people to come through New Mexico, in fact. But that was them wandering. There's actually like a ceremony that you have to do to claim lands. And this is particularly important around waterways, and they had never done that. So by those rules, the Spanish had never taken Texas legally. But the French, if you remember all the way back when we were talking about European conquest of the Americas, the French didn't fare so well in Texas and basically abandoned the colony in a few years. But according to that claim, even though the Spanish had already started populating the coast of Texas and founded San Antonio, which is roughly here, the Jefferson administration claimed that it could go all the way to the Rio Grande. So, in fact, let's see here, where is it? In 1804, a Spanish official said, "The United States have purchased Louisiana from France, and if they succeeded in establishing themselves on the limits of Texas, God keep us from their hands. The U.S. government is the most ambitious, restless, unsteady, caviling, and meddlesome government on earth." This was the Spanish viceroy. So they have all of this kind of debate about where the Louisiana Purchase even counts as. And that includes the northern route too, and that's what the Lewis and Clark expedition go to. They make it all the way to modern-day Oregon. So they literally cross the entirety of what is now the United States, laying claim to the Oregon Territory. Now, the U.S. had actually already visited the Oregon Territory in the 1770s, and multiple times since then, laying claim to that territory multiple times, but this was naval vessels, most of which were merchant vessels, not even naval vessels. So merchants can't actually lay claim for a country. They're private citizens, not the military. And this is, once again, kind of ignoring the people who actually live there, because they're not Europeans, so they don't get to claim land, which we'll get to that next week. But, let's see here. With all of this new land, a neutral ground is created right here in Louisiana to basically say this is where the border is. But the American people want more, so they start doing what's called filibustering. This comes from the Dutch word for freebooter, but basically means pirate. But in this sense, filibustering meant pirating land, that they'd just claim land that was already claimed by another crown and take it by force. And this happened multiple times before 1810. We'll get to one of those. But in 1810, the Republic of West Florida, basically this area right here, was proclaimed, and the U.S. annexed it. So there's already pushes to do that. Filibustering into Texas will become a huge issue that we will talk about in later lectures. At the same time, there's all this new territory, and the U.S. realizes that they need to clamp down on all this new territory, because in 1811, the largest slave revolt in American history takes place in Louisiana, just down the way from New Orleans. In fact, the slaves were trying to march on New Orleans. They had heard about all the stuff that had been happening in Haiti, and they basically wanted to recreate that. Doesn't go so well for them, and a whole bunch of them end up with their heads on pikes. So finally the U.S. decides they need to clamp down on Louisiana. Despite all of this stuff, the Jefferson administration is doing many other things. Despite being about, limiting the government, not raising taxes, and all that kind of stuff, he does more to expand the government's power than Adams. And one of those things was Barbary pirates. Remember, we've been talking about how the Federalists just were bribing off the pirates and that. Well, Jefferson doesn't like the idea of entreating those brown people. He made it very clear in 1785 when he said, the Barbary enslavement was founded on the law of the prophet, that it was written in their Quran that all nations who should not have answered their authority were sinners, that it was their right and duty to make war upon them wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Muslim, well, he doesn't spell it correctly, but every Muslim who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise. Basically, he was expressing that standard Islamophobic sentiment that they're out to get Westerners. And there's a bit of truth to this at this point, because the reason why they are allowed to take slaves of Europeans is because they're not Muslims. But at the same time, you can see Jefferson is proposing basically a conspiracy theory. He thinks that they're out to enslave the entirety of Europe. That's not true at all. So he really takes issue when they start demanding higher tribute. in 1800 during the election. This was part of the election, in fact, that he openly said that he would refuse it, and once he took power, he did. So in May of 1801, a blockade was put around Tripoli, and this blockade had many misadventures where even a ship was captured by the pirates, which is pictured here. The poor ship was a naval vessel that basically were taken by the pirates because, they're pirates, they're good at that, and it's their waters that we were blockading. And so Decatur Jr., the son of that Decatur that we previously talked about, took command of the blockade and sent a small force to set it alight, which they did quite well by invading at night and hitting the powder stores, blowing up the vessel. So even though it was quite a defeat that we had to blow up our own vessel, it's kind of seen as this great victory because, we got to blow it up with the pirates inside, remember. So huge victory in terms of just killing pirates. This blockade continues all the way until 1805, when the U.S. finally decides it's time to try to break them, and we started landing Marines and Blue Jackets. Blue Jackets are just naval officers and men who are working on shore, basically to support Marines. Because at this point, there's not many Marines. If you've heard the Marine hymn, from the shores of Tripoli, this is what that's about. But there were, 5 Marines. So the rest were Blue Jackets. But they land in Alexandria, Egypt, and make a 521-mile hike all the way across the desert along the coast to raid Derna. This raid is extremely... they also pick up mercenaries along the way, a bunch of Egyptian mercenaries. So, because Egyptians are also not so happy with all this. Especially if the U.S. is willing to pay to have them do the expedition. So with only 408 personnel total, 408 naval personnel and many more mercenaries, we don't know the amount of mercenaries, they managed to kill roughly 2,000 people in the fighting in Derna. But part of the promises with the mercenaries is that they're going to, they're going to get some sort of control of this territory. This gets broken by the peace treaty that is signed in June of 1805. But this continues the ransom for American hostages. So in 1815, years later, a more decisive war comes about, basically completely ending it, but this is purely out of bombardment, and the British in between then and now, between 1805 and 1815, had continued to blockade the area, basically making the pirates impossible to operate. But the most decisive blow came in June of 1815, when the U.S. bombarded Tripoli. The U.S. would actually continue to try to campaign against piracy, ending piracy in the Caribbean in 1825, and ending piracy in the Aegean Sea in 1828. basically, because of these wars, we became a fighting force against piracy. At the same time as all this, domestically, many changes were coming about. First came the end of the slave trade, which ended in 1808 because the U.S. couldn't end it according to the Constitution until that date. Literally, as soon as we could end it, we ended it. And this is at the same time as the British who ended it. And so, in consultation with the British after a war that we'll get to later, we end up supporting their effort to end the slave trade internationally in 1815, literally dedicating an entire naval squadron to it. And in fact, at certain points, the U.S. has more ships patrolling the African coast than anywhere else. All kinds of shenanigans happen with that. It's the Navy. They love getting into shenanigans. But only about 100 slave vessels were ever captured. And that slave patrol officially went from 1819 to 1861. So for decades, they only managed to capture about 100. It wasn't very effective, though they'd end up setting up patrols throughout the Caribbean and off the coast of Brazil because of all this. Along with all the with this kind of consolidating power, because once again, Jefferson, despite being supposedly small government, did more to expand the federal government than any president since. I mean, any president before him. But on the 16th of March, 1802, the Military Peace Establishment Act created the standards by which the U.S. military would maintain itself during peacetime. This was especially important because, remember, territories are basically ran by military governors. We have all of these kinds of quasi-wars, and we'll get to the Indian Wars next week. There's all this kind of stuff. So there is a standing military at this point, and there needs to be some way of maintaining it. Another important part of all of this is all those exploration parties, starting with the Corps of Discovery in 1803, are military ventures. So, in fact, if you're an engineering student, the engineering profession in the U.S. was basically started by the military with the creation of West Point. West Point was a military barracks. Remember, that's the place where Benedict Arnold had given it to the British. The whole, it was still in U.S. hands, of course, because it's in upstate New York. And so that became the official military college, starting up the first engineering school in the U.S. The Army Corps of Engineers become kind of the core engineering thing for decades. And these various expeditions to go and find things, for instance, right after the Corps of Discovery launched in 1803, in 1805 there was Pike's expedition down here to New Mexico, actually, though he was betrayed by a traitorous general who basically said to the Spanish, "Hey, we've got an expedition coming your way, go grab them," and so he was captured. But he wrote about Albuquerque on the way down, so kind of interesting. Then, because of all the problems that they had with the vice president, with the 1796 election, the 12th Amendment was passed and ratified, basically making it so that that could never happen, that presidents and vice presidents run on the same ticket. There will actually be a few times in American history where you will have people on the same ticket running in different parties. Specifically, 1864, during the Civil War, because the vice president was a Democrat and Lincoln was a Republican. But this solves one problem, but also, once again, acts to consolidate power because now you have both the president and vice president in the same party and therefore not willing to contradict each other. But one of those vice presidents ends up having issues. Alexander Burr was vice president from 1801, but he ended up getting in a duel with Alexander Hamilton. According to the newspapers, Alexander Hamilton raised his gun during the duel and fired into the air, and Burr killed him anyways. Now, reports vary in terms of whether or not that him raising it was simply because he got shot first. But the story goes that Hamilton graciously threw away his shot and Burr maliciously killed him anyways. Hard to know because that all happens in a few seconds, right? But it sealed Burr's career and, well, also Hamilton's career. He ain't talking anymore. But Burr basically fell out of favor, and after the re-election of Jefferson in 1804, Burr was out. But Burr didn't exactly go away silently. After all, the U.S. had been talking about expansion and how much the Louisiana Purchase included. So his idea was that he would basically create a filibuster. In 1807, a young slave owner in Tennessee claimed to have been part of this conspiracy and reported it. That young slave owner was named Andrew Jackson, and he'll become pretty important later. And so Burr gets hauled in on Jefferson's orders to be tried as a traitor. And at this point, treason, well, even today, constitutionally, treason has a death sentence. So Jefferson is hauling in his former vice president to be tried with capital punishment in mind. They can't actually prove that the conspiracy exists, that if it wasn't just, barroom stuff, but even proposing to filibuster something for your own benefit was quite an issue, especially as a former vice president. But Burr ends up basically just getting acquitted, but falls out of favor, and he'll end up dying in squalor and under an assumed name because his name is so hated. And finally, we have all of this going on because of the Louisiana Purchase. So you can see that there's a significant switch towards France, that the Democratic Republicans were very pro-France. And this has the effect of kind of ruining the Jay Treaty and realigning the U.S. with against Britain, which will come to bite us pretty quickly in the War of 1812, which is next week. So, what's the theme of all this going on? What with the Federalists coming to power and then the Democratic Republicans? What's happening to this new republic?
It's kind of struggling over what its identity is trying to become, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. You have, who do we align with? Which not only has the effect of like causing wars and whatnot, but it also has the effect of being, are we more conservative or are we more radical? The British are seen as the ones who, even though we had just rebelled against them, there's still that like, whoa, but France is just executing people willy-nilly. We don't want to be like that. There's this already debate between like radicalism and conservatism. Everyone's liberal at this point. Nobody's going to frickin' say that they're conservative. But you can see our divide between liberalism and conservatism already growing. Here it's more liberalism versus radicalism. Because liberalism at this point is still very elitist. But it's more, should we be kind of holding back and not be so, not be like the French, or should we continue to separate ourselves from the British? You could see also with like the slave patrols and that we're already starting to make ties with the British militarily. The Jay Treaty sets up a number of ways in which the British are supposed to remove themselves from forts in the Northwest, giving it completely to American territory, though we'll see that they kind of violate that. But still, yeah, very much about identity. What else is going on here? Like, why is it called the early republic rather than like a new nation?
Because we're still kind of figuring out like what works and what we can. We haven't like established exactly what a nation is going to be founded on, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. There's this open question about will there be a powerful central government? What's the meaning of liberty? Think about it. Like, Supreme Court hadn't had the power to strike down anything at this point. Actually, right at the tail end of Jefferson's presidency, they basically gave themselves the power of judicial review. So during the Sedition Act, they didn't have the power to say that that's unconstitutional. Only the Jeffersonian Republicans could do so. But they had to get elected first. So the Federalists, on the other hand, are willing to say that that's perfectly fine, that censoring speech, sending people to jail for making jokes, like, that's fine. So you have a very real difference in what people think of as liberty. The Federalists think of it as more financial security, that, you have a central bank, you have good tariffs, you're building up roads, all that kind of fun stuff, giving people who have money the ability to make more of it. The Jeffersonian Republicans are more about those yeoman farmers, that they believe in, the little guy, supposedly. Problem is, of course, they're represented by slave owners and powerful northern elites. So that's pretty suspect, and we can see, for all Jefferson's talk about, liberty being for yeoman farmers doesn't exactly work out for them, does it? He expends the federal government more than anyone before him. So you have this kind of tit for tat, but at the same time, it does seem to be going in a certain direction. What is that direction?
Is it towards a more centralized government, like trying to get them more power?
Yeah, you could say that, definitely. There's certainly a growth of government from both regimes, both the Federalists, which I'm including Washington there, but he's technically not a part of a party, to the Jeffersonian Republicans, who, despite their preaching, they're very much about expansion. But what else seems to be happening here in terms of consolidating power? Like, what is it for? Like, why is there that trajectory towards consolidating power? Well, what's going on? Think about significance here. Think about, like, what does this mean? What does this consolidation of power mean for us today?
It helped the United States grow more powerful in a way.
Yeah. Nation building, right? As you had said before, there's this kind of argument over what national identity will be. Realize historians generally don't think that nations exist until basically the 1840s. There's a lot of debate over this, of course, but for the last 50 years or so, it's been the general interpretation that the rise of nations in 1848 is also the creation of nations, or the spring of nations is the name of that revolution. But for instance, a lot of historians will argue that the U.S. is not a nation until the Civil War. You can't have a nation divided until it is reunited. But there's this need for power, right? Not just within the country, but without. A lot of this is international maneuvering, right? This is about growing the country and all that kind of stuff. And though at this point it's very much about elites, about basically them making more money, a lot of it is still beneficial to the little guy, because suddenly with more land means it's a lot easier to get nice big plots of land to farm. So even the little guy is helped. Rising tide lifts all ships and whatnot. But what also is important about the missteps, like the Alien and Sedition Acts? What's the significance of that?
Just kind of like the United States needs to make these mistakes in order to know, we can't do this in the future. Better make them early on than wait them early.
We'll definitely make the same mistake. One could argue that we've made the same mistake fairly recently with the Patriot Act. But certainly in terms of the Sedition Act, the Espionage and Sedition Acts passed in 1918 certainly, in fact, the Sedition Act of 1918 actually borrows some of the language from Adams. And the Espionage Act is actually still on the books. For instance, Chelsea Manning was prosecuted by it. If what's his first name? Snowden? Edward Snowden. If Edward Snowden manages to come back to the U.S., he'll be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. This is still a thing that's around, and So we haven't really learned that lesson, have we? So what else is the significance of it?
It sort of puts like a little bit of, not, I won't say fear, but I guess that fear towards like the government in general. So people are naturally just not always going to be like, or it creates like an opposition, but it also creates like a fear towards, like a natural fear towards like the big government.
It helps consolidate power, right? That's definitely one way of looking at it. You know, part of this whole trend of the early republic is trying to consolidate power, right? And though Jefferson certainly did the most of it, of this early period, you know, the previous two presidents had certainly done some of it themselves. And in fact, think about what the Constitution itself is for, right? Consolidating power. To basically to fix the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Then, with less power, there was actually more problems. So, you know, it's kind of a tit for tat kind of thing, right? But at the same time, with the Alien and Sedition Act, what does it lead to? You could think about it, because this is about significance, right? There's many ways of viewing significance. You can talk about, you know, its meaning, as in like, you know, this is something we should learn from. You could talk about, you know, its overall context, that consolidation of power. But you can also talk about what it causes. What is the revolution of 1800?
They elected Jefferson.
Jefferson gets elected. Basically, the Jeffersonian Republicans come to power. This basically spells the death of the Federalists. Though they will last, they will never have another Federalist president. In fact, one could argue that the current Democratic Party is actually derivative of the Jeffersonian Republicans. There'll be a bit of a hitch there in 1828, but you know, if you just forget about Andrew Jackson and everything, you could say that the current Democrats are from Jefferson's party. Although they will go through many, many changes. Because by the end of this class, they seem like arch conservatives, you know, absolutely racist, and just like the complete opposite of what you'd think of a Democrat today. You know, very anti-civil rights. But that changes over time, right? That's what history is, change over time, right? So think about that in terms of significance. You have this change created by the Alien and Sedition Act, that the Jeffersonian Republicans come to power. You see all this significance, right? What that means. Because that's what's going to be on the test, right? That's what you know. You can do one of those things. You can talk about like meaning. You can talk about context, and you can talk about causation. But in either case, it's all about historical significance. Any other questions?
I just wanted to ask, earlier you were saying how people were being jailed due to like speaking out, I guess, against the government.
Mm-hmm.
How was this like treated because of like the First Amendment, I guess? Like,
Well, remember, so the Supreme Court has the ability of judicial review. Basically, they can rule something to be unconstitutional. That's why currently there's this big debate over who should be the next Supreme Court justice nominated, because there's this real fear that they will overturn Roe v. Wade. In 1798, when the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed, they did not have that power.
They basically granted it to themselves. Now, there's a whole argument about how Jefferson, when it happened during his presidency, found it to be like the most tyrannical thing ever. He railed against it. But they didn't really use judicial review in terms of like rights until basically after the Civil War. They'll talk about property rights quite a bit prior to that, to the point of, we'll get to long later in the class, the Dred Scott decision, where they basically say that black people cannot be citizens. Most of it has to do with property rights at this point. So there's no real way of counteracting something that violates the First Amendment at this point. It's basically an ideal, that it's in the Constitution, but really the only way to enforce the Constitution is through, legislation. But it's legislation that's the problem. Answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? All right, well, have a good day.